Well, I'm making a public notice on the slave created identification, the U.S. or state corporate slavery or enslavement identification. Identification is for slaves. Leaders create identification for slaves. That's what they did to the Jews when they put the star on them. That was an identification to identify they were Jews. I do not consent to you trying to force me to have a driver license or state created driver license or ID that creates or turns me into a slave that is to be identified. I am not a slave. I do not need an identification when I walk up to someone or someone walks up to me and they're a regular person like I am. They're not a cop. They're not of any authority. And they can't come up to me and say, I need to see your ID to know that you are who you and what you say you are. We don't do that between each other. We're not slaves between each other. If I was to force you to have identification so I can be able to identify you, I'm turning you into my slave. I do not need identification. It's slavery to force me to have identification for a corporation, a state corporation and or a U.S. federal corporation. I don't work for you. I don't need identification. Slaves and employees need identification. I don't. I'm not an employee of anyone. I'm self-employed. I'm my own employee. I contract through others. That don't make me their employee. Now, I would have to do the job the way they want it done, unless they know I know what I'm doing, because I've done it long enough that I can do it my way. Other than that, no one is to force me to have ID. That's slavery. So state-created forced identification is slavery, and slavery was abolished. I do not work for you. You cannot force me to have identification. I'm not an agent, employee, or officer with authority that works for the state and or the U.S. federal corporation, known as Washington, D.C. I was never born in Washington, D.C., so I am not a U.S. citizen. There is no birth certificate that the United States Federal Corporation can provide in court to state that I am a U.S. citizen. I'm not a U.S. citizen. And I'm not a resident of a state. I do not work for the state to be a resident of the state to have ID. Employees and slaves are to have identification. And I'm not a slave. And you're not going to force me to be one. You have no jurisdiction over me. None of you. Unless you try to force me to be your slave. And then we'll have something going on that you don't want when you come try to force me to be under your jurisdiction as a freaking slave. I'm not your slave, and you cannot force me to have ID. You cannot force me to have identification on my property when I get new property. I'm not your slave. I do not have to title my property. I do not have to register my property because I do not work for you and you're not my slave. This is to the state representative, the governor, the state prosecutor, the state sheriff, and all the sheriffs. This is a public announcement to the police chief, the mayor, the president, the vice president, the U.S. prosecutor, all of you, the U.S. Supreme Court, all of you is right now on notice. I am not your slave, and you cannot force me to have an ID. I do not work for you, and you can't enslave me and force me to work for you outside of me not getting or going in and applying to work with you through a contract. I don't need ID. I'm a free American. I have sovereign immunity from your jurisdiction. You all take care. Bye.